If there's one thing that's been consistent in regards to Griffith's character, it's his hunger for power. When he was a child, he decided to become a king, perhaps on a whim. However, unlike most children, he persisted in making that dream come true. And by the time he became a man, he understood the real value of kingship wasn't in the riches or the ornaments, it was the power that came with it. In order to get that power, Griffith needed to become strong himself, and for a long time he really was, until he wasn't. The day Guts left the Band of the Falcon is the day Griffith's life course-corrected and put him on the path that he now walks as the God Hand Femto. But what if there was another way for him to get said power? What if Griffith, not Guts, had gotten his hands on the Berserker Armor? What would that world look like? We'll be exploring the answers to those questions and more in this video. Two enigmas that entered the history books in similar fashion: Griffith and Geeseric. To understand why we even bring up the prospect of Griffith receiving the Berserker Armor, we must understand his connection to the man that first used it, Supreme King Geeseric. On paper, these two characters have had pretty similar lives in that they're both nobodies that became somebodies thanks to war. Geeseric rose to power 1,000 years before the current timeline. He was the only person in human history to have unified the entire species under his banner, and that kind of thing doesn't just happen by playing nice with people. The Supreme King took advantage of the fact that the entire world was reeling from a massive population deletion to take over. It's said that back in those days, war, famine, and disease wiped out 1/3 of all humans, and the chaos such a situation induces is ideal for conquest. No one knew a single thing about him, where he came from, or how he managed to gather an army large enough to steamroll the entire world. But once his conquest began, there wasn't a man in the world unaware of his reputation. Geeseric's ruthlessness in the field of battle was legendary. The Supreme King would ride into war donning a haunting skull-shaped helmet, and judging by the fact that one of his nicknames was the King of Galloping Death, we can assume that he was a cavalryman without peer. Once his conquest was finished, he established the city of Midland, yes, the city of Midland, and proceeded to rule over mankind for a decent amount of time. Eventually, his kingdom collapsed due to a natural disaster, wink wink, and since then, nobody's come even close to replicating his feats. The Midland royal family claimed his standard and his bloodline and started ruling over the area that used to be his capital city, and that was that, at least until Griffith showed up. Much like Geeseric, no one knows anything about Griffith's history, including us readers, save for one thing: his dream. We know that Griffith grew up as an orphan on the cobblestoned alleys of a nameless city, whose castle inspired his journey to kingship. That's all we know about him as a person. Well, that and the fact that he's the leader of the Grim Reapers of the battlefield of his era, the Band of the Falcon. Like Geeseric, Griffith's explosion onto the global theater of war was sudden, unprecedented, and utterly revolutionary. At a time where bodies and gold decided the outcome of battles, the White Falcon used strategy to defeat his enemies. He started with a small crew of thieves and grew his band to nearly 5,000 men by the time he became a part of Midland's 100-Year War. In all his years as a mercenary leader, Griffith hadn't suffered a single defeat, and even his retreats were a tactical success for whoever was employing him. For instance, in the Golden Age Part 3, his Falcons extended a siege that was supposed to last 3 days into a 3-month-long engagement. That kind of thing is only possible when your plans are inscrutable and your men are loyal as hell. Like Geeseric, Griffith took advantage of a dying population as well, but these people weren't experiencing things like famine or the plague. The cause of death for them was war and war alone. The Kingdom of Midland was on a steep decline after spending nearly a century fighting Tudor and making no headway. The people were frustrated with the losses, and even the king had begun to pray for a savior. That savior turned out to be Griffith, whose band completely turned the tide of the 100-Year War in Midland's favor. They even managed to recapture the fortress of Doldry, the location that sparked the conflict between Tudor and Midland, without any backup or assistance from the latter. With such incredible military accomplishments, the king had no choice but to promote Griffith, a commoner, to the status of White Phoenix General. And had he bided his time, he could have even become the King of Midland within a few years. But alas, this is where his path diverges from Geeseric's. Where their paths diverged, why Griffith getting the Berserker Armor wasn't possible. The person who caught on to the similarities between Geeseric's life and Griffith's life is the one man who's been a part of both, Guts. The Black Swordsman fought underneath the Falcon banner for 3 years and was a big part of his legend as Midland's savior. He was one of the swords that would have earned Griffith the throne had he not gotten the idea of living life for himself into his head. As for how he became a part of Geeseric's life, all you need to do is look at his relationship with Skull Knight. Guts is reliving the consequences of Geisric's hunger for power and control, which, in his case, is because of Griffith, ironically enough. But while those two men have many things in common, despite the centuries between them, the biggest difference between Geisric and Griffith is how they approached their dreams. The Supreme King's path to kingship was built upon the backs of those that fought with him, but he wasn't far behind them. In fact, oftentimes, he was the one leading the charge. We say this not just because of his reputation, but also because he was the previous owner of the Berserker Armor. The reason Geisric became feared across the world was because he himself fought like a feral beast in battle. The Berserker Armor was the tool with which he built his kingdom, and everything Geisric achieved was through his own efforts. Sure, you can say that he had the advantage of having magic users and the armor in his possession, but at the time, the entire world was aware of spiritual beings. Geisric being the only would-be king with magical assistance is a bit of a hard pill to swallow. Him using magic to combat other people that also used magic isn't taking a shortcut, it's fighting fire with fire. He believed in leading from the front and took personal charge of many of his commands, including the torture of a certain sage. Perhaps that was his shortcoming, because Geisric's personal vendetta against that sage resulted in the first eclipse and the birth of Void. Griffith, on the other hand, is not ready to get his own hands dirty to win the throne, at least not in the public eye. The White Falcon was a strategist and a warrior without peer once upon a time. His skills with a sword were so refined that he toyed with a guy like Guts, who could have turned him into mincemeat with one well-timed blow. But as the years progressed, he came to realize he couldn't capture his throne with just a sword because A, it would take too long, and B, that kind of thing no longer gave someone the right to rule. In the 1,000 years that had passed between Geisric's downfall and Griffith's rise, the monarchy had tied itself down to several institutions and traditions, precisely because of upstarts like Griffith. They knew that if another Geisric were to appear from out of nowhere, then strength couldn't be the basis of their defense. So they made bloodlines and politics their foundation. Anyone that tried to claim a throne and wasn't related to the royal family would be wiped out as a usurper. Griffith could have certainly given this more honest and honorable path a decent hand, but to him, speed was of the essence. This slow, meandering process of building up an army only to lose a significant amount of it during some conflict and then having to rebuild again, it was just cumbersome to him. The White Falcon could keep fighting and taking incremental steps towards realizing his dreams, but what if he died before achieving it? His single-minded pursuit of kingship leads to some rather shady decision-making, which is where our public eye comment comes into play. It's not like Griffith couldn't get down and dirty, it's that he cared too much about the optics that came with it. The White Falcon sold his body to a perverted nobleman so he could exploit his wealth. Neither of them could talk about their relationship and preserve their social status, so neither did. But that money allowed Griffith to reach a point where Midland trusted him implicitly, and then he silenced the guy anyway. He assassinated all of his political rivals within the royal court and seduced the princess, despite not loving her, because that was the quickest path to becoming king. Griffith is a man who will take every shortcut available to him in order to win, and that's what separates him from Geisric. Where the Supreme King fought for what he wanted himself, Griffith eventually took a back seat and let other people handle the grunt work for him, while he played the larger Game of Thrones. He manipulated and exploited people with full awareness of what he was doing because Griffith knew his appearance and outward personality made others see him as this shining white knight. He didn't want to distort that perception, but he also wanted to become king, so he was honestly quite lucky to come across someone like Guts. Guts followed orders without question, and that's exactly what Griffith needed to execute several of his schemes. It's because taking shortcuts for power is in his nature that he eventually ends up becoming a God Hand. When you strip away all the emotions and the gut-wrenching visuals from the eclipse, you start to see it for what it is, a means for Griffith to become as powerful as he needed to be to fulfill his dream. He was the definition of powerless shortly before it. He had been tortured for nearly a year and lost mobility as well as sanity. All he knew was that Guts made him so powerless that he could no longer pursue his dream, which is why the God Hand's offer was so enticing to him. They basically told him that if he were to sacrifice his friends, he'd be granted raven black wings with which he could soar to the highest summit. Translation, they'd give him all the power he needed to become king. Griffith had seen just how strong apostles like Zod and Wild were, so he knew this deal would work for him. It's the fact that Geisric wouldn't even consider making such a decision that made him totally different from Griffith. Sure, Griffith might be trying to claim the Supreme King's legacy, but his methods involve changing the world itself, just so it would fit his narrative. Geisric made do with what he had and grasped his power with his own hands. But this brings us to the main question of our video. What if Griffith had followed Geisric's footsteps down to the T? What if he too acquired the Berserker Armor? How would that have changed things? Let's find out. What if Griffith wore the Berserker Armor? Would he handle it better than Guts? First off, we just want to preface this by saying we know the Berserker Armor could never get to Griffith. It was under Flora's care when the Falcon was still a human, and Enoch Village is too far from the place where he was trying to establish his influence. Having said that, Griffith could have truly become Geisric 2.0 if he did get it. One of the biggest reasons for his emotional collapse was the fact that he could no longer fight. And we aren't talking about post-torture Griffith in particular. The Falcon had lost his edge well before that. In the 3 years that he spent courting the Midland royal family, Griffith had become more of a traditional general than a general soldier. He'd often sit behind with the reserve troops and the rest of Midland's high command, while Guts and the rest executed his strategies. This was fine with him because by sacrificing battle time, he was gaining important political ground. However, if he had kept up with his training, he could have probably kept Guts from leaving. Griffith became so consumed with becoming king that he neglected his swordplay and way overestimated himself on that fateful snowy morning. Guts outclassed him with one move, and that was the end of his dream. Of course, Griffith could have soldiered on, but he didn't. He felt as though he'd given the power over his own life to Guts, and when he left, it went with him. He tried rekindling it by seducing Charlotte and gaining control over her, but that could never fill the void in his heart. And then, Griffith became powerless physically as well, because during his year in the Tower of Rebirth, he had his arm and leg tendons stolen from him, and his tongue ripped out of his mouth. Things like giving a command or swinging a sword were now impossible, and this is why he needed the power of evil. But we'd like to argue that he could have achieved a similar effect had he just used the Berserker Armor instead. The Berserker Armor, for all its nastiness, does one thing exceptionally well, and that's keeping its wearer in go mode at all times. Just look at how it keeps Guts alive so he can continue to draw on its power. Whenever the Black Swordsman takes significant damage, like getting his bones broken or a hole in his chest, the Berserker Armor gets to work and patches him up. It rearranges his bones and holds them in place so he can continue fighting without interference. It plugs up the hole in his chest so he stops bleeding out long enough to finish the fight. The Berserker Armor has allowed Guts to withstand 2 lightning bolts and the flames of a Spirit of Woe, all of which would have killed him under normal circumstances. If Griffith got hold of the Berserker Armor, especially after his torture, he'd have likely recovered his mobility for as long as he donned it. The way it works is that it becomes sort of an exoskeleton for the user when their odes align, and takes full advantage of their anatomy. Guts' arm cannon doesn't work like a regular hand, but when he's possessed by the armor, it does. If Griffith acquired the Berserker, his arm and leg tendons would have been rejoined by it so he could have used them to their maximum potential. If that happens, then he doesn't need to make a sacrifice in exchange for power. If the White Falcon had found the armor before he enlisted for Midland, he could have replicated Geisric's trajectory and even taken over the world with his own strength. The shape of his helmet would likely be the same as his regular one because the Berserker Armor's helmet shape reflects its user's inner beast of darkness. For Skull Knight, it was a skull. For Guts, it's the wolf-like head that's the representation of his own malice. So it makes sense that Griffith's would be the Falcon head, because that has become synonymous with his character design. He wouldn't be able to fly like he does with his God Hand form, because the Berserker doesn't spawn wings for its wearer, but his super strength leaping abilities would have had the desired effect. From a physical perspective, all of Griffith's powerlessness would have been driven away by the armor, but that's where the buck stops rolling. The major factor in using the Berserker Armor isn't how your body holds up to it, it's how your mind does. For all its incredible physical advantages, the Berserker Armor only numbs out its user's pain. It doesn't negate the damage incurred by it. Once it's taken off, that accumulated damage hits the user so hard they could spend weeks, if not months, recovering from it. What's worse is, even if they managed to somehow not take any damage while using it, their brains would eventually deteriorate to a point where they wouldn't be able to recognize friend from foe. And, to top it all off, the more a person uses the armor, the weaker their physical senses become, until they reach a point of no return. The Berserker Armor is like a highly addictive drug in that regard. Once the user tastes its power, that is all they'll crave, but using it more and more will increase the risk to their lives even further. And that's if they don't do something drastic to themselves before that day comes. Psychologically speaking, the Berserker Armor creates a hotbed for its users' negative emotions, all of which fester and bloom the longer they spend synced up with hate, rage, malevolence, violence. All of these things are amplified to the nth degree. You need to keep your emotions damned behind a stone wall when you're in contact with it, because otherwise, you'll lose yourself in more ways than one. Guts is a relatively level-headed guy most of the time. He certainly has a strong grip over most of his emotions, save anger, which fuels his footsteps to this day. But even he can't hold back the Berserker Armor all the time, so expecting such a thing from a man as haphazard as Griffith is wishful thinking. For all his calmness and composure, Griffith is an emotional cyclone that can burst at any given moment. He can't control or differentiate between his feelings, which was made clear as daylight in chapter 49. He couldn't even keep his emotions towards Guts in a straight line. Jealousy, friendship, malice, tenderness, sorrow, longing, all of it coexisted in a state where none were addressed, but all were implied. Introducing a weapon as dangerous as the Berserker Armor into the mix would only make him worse. What's more is that unlike Guts, who has things he wants to protect, Griffith only has his naive childhood dream to keep him alive. He could have had friends had he given them enough attention, but he didn't, so here we are. When Guts loses control of the armor, he can be brought back to equilibrium by reminding him of his priorities. With Griffith, his priority is conquest, and the Berserker would only amplify that feeling without giving him any wiggle room. Not to mention, unlike Guts and Geisric, he wouldn't have a magic user on hand to help him out unless he somehow managed to locate and recruit Sonya 2 arcs prior to her introduction. So, even if he did get his hands on the Berserker Armor, we doubt Griffith could have handled it better than Guts because the mismanagement of his emotions is what leads to him becoming a God Hand in the first place. And besides, shortcuts aren't supposed to leave you beaten within an inch of your lives every time you use them, are they? Marvelous verdict! So that's our take on what would happen if Griffith got the Berserker Armor instead of Guts. We'd like to think that he wouldn't rampage across the world once he got that death machine, but who are we kidding? The first people he'd take out as Berserker Griffith would likely be his own soldiers. That's how out of control we think he'd become. It might have helped him get over his disabilities, sure, but it would also bring all of his darkness right to the surface, and he doesn't want that. The White Falcon would rather hide the bloodstains on his body with many feathers than wear them proudly, and if he tries bargaining with the Berserker Armor, it's game over for him. But that's enough out of us. What do you guys think? Would Griffith handle the Berserker Armor better than Guts, or would he flub it like we kinda think he would? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and remember, keep on struggling, strugglers.